Hello and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we will be looking at the remarkable case of a haunted Welsh farmhouse where strange supernatural screaming, wailing, and knocking not only heralded an upcoming death, but had an uncanny connection with events taking place across the Atlantic Ocean. Because we are going international on this episode with a spooky story that starts in Wales but ends in America. So you really are going to want to stick around right until the end of this episode, when all will become clear. And so, to begin at the beginning. And this account is a remarkable account. Not my words, but the words of the folklorist who recorded these events a century ago. It is a remarkable account. To give it its full title, a remarkable account of knocking and wailing before death, which, frankly, is a title which nowadays would come with a spoiler warning. A remarkable account of knocking and wailing before death. And this knocking and wailing before death took place a few miles just outside Newcastle Emlyn, a lovely little town on the Avon Teifi or River Teifi, specifically in a farmhouse called Penrallt Hebog, a wonderful Welsh name, Penrallt Hebog, which we are told is situated in the parish of Betws Evan in the county of Cardiganshire. And this might not seem like the most important of points to dwell on, but the county is important here, and it's difficult to pinpoint because Cardiganshire is a historical county. Today, Newcastle Emlyn would be considered part of the county of Carmarthenshire, but these events take place just outside and just over the river, tiptoeing into Ceredigion, the neighbouring county. So these events take place certainly very, very close to the border of Carmarthenshire and Ceredigion, and why that's important will be explained later on. But back to this farm, and on Penrallt Hebog we are told there was an other house on the same farm known as Penrallt Fach, Fach being little, Penrallt Fach. And at the time of these events, which would have been the early 1880s, Penrallt Fach, Little Penrallt, was the home of a tailor named Samuel Thomas. He lived there with his wife, and he is described as an intelligent, middle-aged man who, at the time of writing in the early 1900s, our folklorist writes that he was still alive. Of course, he spoke to him personally about these events, although presumably he's not still alive today. If he is still in the area, I imagine he is the one doing the haunting on that Carmarthenshire-Ceredigion border, and there's a paranormal investigation just waiting to happen if anyone wants to take up the challenge. But if we go back to when he was alive, to the 1880s when these events took place, he recalled what he described as a very strange incident in that farmhouse. And it all started one morning very early when Thomas heard a knocking at the door of his bedroom. Yes, the terrible special effects are back. It's been a while. That was a treat for long-time listeners, if treat is the correct word. But one morning, very early, when Thomas heard a knocking at the door of his bedroom, and he inquired from his bed, "Who is there?" There was no reply and all was quiet. And so he simply went back to sleep. He can't have been that concerned about this spooky knocking. He couldn't even be bothered to get out of bed and have a look to see who might be there. He simply went to sleep until the next morning when, again, he heard knocking at the door, though not at the bedroom door this time. This was at the front door of the house. And I assure you that was the authentic sound of a Welsh Victorian front door being knocked early in the morning, and definitely not some random book that was lying around my office before I started recording. But once again, from his bed, Samuel shouts out, All right, I am getting up now. And it's comforting to know that after all this time, Welsh men who are disturbed in bed still respond with the same reply. All right, man, I'll be there now. But of course, if you've been listening carefully, the day before, he simply asked who was there. Now he's determined to actually set foot outside of his bed and to go and investigate. And he walks towards the front door, he opens it and... can you believe it? Not a single soul can be seen. There is nobody there. And I do like the use of the word soul here. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Not a single soul could be seen. And Thomas, we are told, was quite surprised and perplexed as to who could have come to disturb him at 5 o'clock in the morning, 2 mornings, one after the other, and disappear so mysteriously. In fairness, I think we would all be surprised and perplexed. And to continue, no voice had been heard, nor the sound of footsteps, only the knocking at the door. And at this point in the story, especially if you've heard previous episodes, you might be starting to think this is just going to escalate and escalate each day until it reaches some kind of breaking point, but it does the opposite. After that second day, no knocking is heard again for quite some time. In fact, it was 12 months exactly, 1 year to the day, in early January, which, thinking about it, maybe explains why he was so reluctant to get out of bed earlier. If these events are taking place in January, I imagine it gets a little bit chilly in Newcastle Emlyn around that time of year. But a full 12 months later, one of Thomas's brothers from another part of Wales came to visit and to spend a day with him. And so it was that one day during that week, the two brothers went out with their guns to shoot some game. Clearly, that's how they enjoyed passing the time. But when they returned to the house again, in the evening, Thomas went to his workshop to do some job. And the word job is in inverted commas here, air quotes, which to us nowadays, it makes it sound a bit sarcastic. He's just off to do a job. But in this case, in the good old, more innocent, more honest days, it simply means the men were hard workers. And even after a day off enjoying himself with his brother, he still had a little bit of work to do before going to bed. And we are told that he was busily engaged in making a suit of clothes, which, being a tailor, that's exactly what you'd expect him to be doing. There he is, doing some tailoring. And as he was doing so, he heard, quite suddenly, 2 knocks coming from the window. And that, I assure you, was the genuine sound of a Welsh Victorian window being knocked not once, but twice. And he thought, as you would, that some friend outside wanted to call his attention to something. But when he looked out the window, there was nobody to be seen. And after a while, the knocking returned. Again and again, and continued for 10 whole minutes. Fear not, I am not going to tap for 10 minutes. And as you've probably noticed, the big difference between the knock-in here and the knock-in a year previously is not only is it at the window as opposed to the door, but it's much more sustained. This isn't a couple of knocks and off. This is continuous knocking for 10 minutes. And it's also taking place in the evening as opposed to the morning. And fast forward 24 hours, and on the next night, the knocking at the window continued, as with the previous evening, between 10 and 8 o'clock. But nothing was seen. And I did double check that. It's not a typo. It feels quite extraordinary to me. It started at 10 o'clock at night and continued until 8 a.m. the next day, which, if you can imagine, I mean, that's annoying me just doing that for a few seconds on this podcast. I'm annoying myself doing it. But for that to continue for 10 hours throughout the entire night, that must have been very, very, very annoying to put it politely. And if that wasn't enough, fast forward another 24 hours. And can you believe it? On the third night, there was a knocking at the window several times, and it was much louder and more violent than it had been on the 2 previous evenings. Mr. Thomas and his young assistant, who also happens to be there. I love how the folklorist just drops random people into the story. I have no idea how long this assistant's been hanging around for, but he's certainly there tonight. And Mr. Thomas and his assistant decide this window is being struck with so much force, so much violence, they need to stop and keep an eye on it. Things have really escalated, and if they escalate further, they could be showered in a hail of glass. However, when they looked at the window, the knocking ceased. But the moment they looked away to resume their work, the knocking returned again. And if 2 witnesses wasn't enough, to add weight to this, we're told at some point there were several young men in this room who all experienced it. Again, I have no idea why this room was full of young men. Again, the folklorist has just added a bunch of characters, but for whatever reason, there they were, and they all experienced this sound. And even his wife, good old Mrs. Tailor, who was in a totally different apartment, we are told, could hear this knocking. And at this point, where it's gone beyond a man being disturbed in the morning to multiple witnesses all hearing increasingly agitated, increasingly violent knocking that is getting more and more persistent, this is when our folklorist puts a name on this phenomena and describes it as spirit knockings. These sounds were supposedly spirit knocking. And then things really escalated, an escalation of the escalation. And at this point, the noises were starting to be heard abroad, as it's described, although abroad in this sense I'm taken to mean beyond the confines of the farmhouse itself. It was heard far and wide outside the farmhouse. I don't think it means it was heard over the seas in foreign countries, in Italy, Jamaica, Canada. Although, as you'll hear at the end of this episode, maybe the suggestion that it might be heard in foreign countries isn't as ridiculous as it first sounds. But in this case, the sounds were being heard in and around that farmhouse. In fact, they were heard so far and wide, they reached the ears of the farmer who owned that property, who, we are told, to quote, did not believe in superstition, but when he heard the knocking, he was convinced that there was something supernatural about it. So even these late 19th century skeptics were convinced, and they don't come much more skeptical than salt of the earth 19th century Westphalian farmers. But in this case, he was convinced it was supernatural, and if we hadn't had enough escalation already, on the 5th night, it escalated. The escalation escalated further when a very loud knock at the door was heard. I don't know if I caught that or not, but I was a little bit too over enthusiastic with that sound effect, and I've managed to knock a lot of stuff off my desk that I didn't particularly want to knock off my desk. But anyway, on the 5th night, a very loud knock at the door was heard, so loud that it sounded like somebody was trying to break through the door. Not just open the door, to break through it. I'm picturing Jack Nicholson in The Shining here, to break through the door. And on the 6th evening, when Mr. Samuel the tailor went out for a short walk, he heard such noises that he described as sounding like 200 horses rushing past him, which is a wonderful description, and I'm not even going to attempt to recreate that sound, especially after the carnage I caused with the last sound effect. But if you can imagine 200 wild horses rushing past, that is what Samuel Thomas is experiencing. And there's more, because on the 7th and the 8th evenings, this isn't being phased out this time, the knocking still continued. And on the 9th evening, Thomas went out with a gun in his hand. Again, long-term listeners will know that guns rarely work against ghosts. In fact, they have the opposite effect. But he went out with his gun and found that there was no one to be seen anywhere. So, as with the knocking at the window earlier, where they stopped to watch to see what would happen, if you go looking, you find nothing. He could see no sign of anyone, although he did start to hear something. He heard some groaning groaning voice in the air and doleful wailing. Again, I will not attempt to recreate the sounds. That's the last thing anyone wants to hear. But he heard some groaning voice in the air and doleful wailing and, unsurprisingly, rushed home to his house quite frightened, we are told. However, afterwards, there was no more knocking ever again. So, there was this terrible groaning voice and this doleful wailing, which effectively marked the culmination of the haunting, for want of a better word. And afterwards, or certainly for the decades that followed, there was no more knocking at the house. That was the end of that. And that, you might think, is the end of our story. And that is where I would traditionally wrap up this episode. It would be a rather anticlimactic finale, but that's usually the case with these stories. When they're real life stories, you can't just invent a fantastical ending. If things just stop, they just stop. However, that is not the case with this episode, because there is a sting in the tail, as it were. Because at exactly the same time, in January 1883, when these knocks were being heard in Penrastfach Cottage, across the seas, in a faraway mystical land known as America, which, incidentally, I'll be visiting next month, there was an old woman dying. Now, sadly, our folklorist doesn't tell us where in America. I appreciate it's a pretty big place, even bigger than Carmarthenshire, even bigger than Carmarthenshire and Ceredigion combined. But this woman was dying somewhere in America, a country she had emigrated to after her husband passed away in Wales. And her last dying wish was to be returned home to Cymru to die and be buried next to her husband in the Welsh soil. But that, sadly, was now impossible. The end was nigh, and she would not be setting foot on home soil again. And as she lay there in pain in her final days, her tortured wails and groans and cries rang out around her American home. And so heartrending were they reverberated through time and space and across the waters back to her homeland of Wales, back to her home county of Cardiganshire, back to the home where she shared so many happy memories with her husband, back to Penrastfach Cottage just outside Newcastle Emlyn. Now, of course, nobody in Wales knew this at the time. Samuel Thomas certainly didn't know. But in America, keeping watch at this lady's bedside was a man from Newcastle Emlyn, a man called Mr. Lloyd, who, upon returning to Wales, and of course these are in the days when you can't just hop on a flight and be there the next day, this would have taken him some time to get back. But when he did, he explained the details which exactly lined up with what they had experienced in that cottage. And as far as our folklorist is concerned, this solves the mystery of the spirit knockings. And it also confirms the truth of the old belief that death makes his presence known by knocking at the door of the relatives, of friends, of those he is about to strike. Which to me does pose an interesting question. If death was in some way signalling to the people back home in the cottage that the end was nigh for this lady, surely those groaning sounds are the sounds she made in utter despair on her final night on earth. Therefore, was she in some way also responsible for the knocking? Were they working together in collaboration in some way? Alas, these are questions, dear listener, I will have to leave you to ponder, because we have reached the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. As usual, if you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button And if you really enjoyed it and you'd like to support it, you can leave a nice review, a nice rating, tell all your friends about it, or you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very, very, very much appreciated, and it all goes towards keeping this nonsense on the air. If you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media. I'm on all of the main platforms, and as well as this podcast, I've written a number of books about similar, weird, and wonderful subjects which are available from all good bookshops, offline and on. And on that note, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you do hear it's probably just someone on the other side of the world. Until next time, no star.